Does it matter? Does it matter? What would happen if you sit somewhere else?
I'll lose my mind. No, it doesn't matter.
You should like wash your bag out.
Huh?
Every day there's glitter somewhere.
It's not a fault.
It's magical, Eden, never change. Carry glitter everywhere.
Anyone else like lagging behind a little bit?
Like in our brains?
No. Like the
Probably.
students who are on their way.
Well,
Oh,
we don't know entirely because some people may have switched around their courses.
Oh, they might switch over courses. Oh, right. Oh, I didn't check the thing. Okay, so I'm just gonna trust the system and I'll find out later.
Interesting system.
Something about my first
Democratic society is falling apart.
Well, then like, he says I have 2 extra credits. This there. Right, but then I'm like, so can I drop one? He said, no, can you 10 elective credits and I have 3, because modern democracy is 3 credits. And then Udi's is still 3,
you saw my
as an
message?
elective. Yeah.
You're on for that.
So I have 2 extra credits, but I can't drop a class.
Okay.
Yeah. Because anyway.
Oh, waiting, do we have any, anyone else wants to join in for the first presentation?
oh,
Bruno?
I will.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we're off just one start.
Just-
Good.
Confused, Trump.
Okay, so we'll just meet, maybe like we'll meet after the first class during the break there. and- Okay, that'll be good. All right, let's get started here.
These class doesn't count as an elective credit.
So that's what I want to say. Well, maybe you can tell them that like, I don't think it's like this. I guess.
Okay.
Should not really care. Like, I don't know, like, I don't know, but just. He said like.
All right.
Should have one next year.
Good afternoon. Let me see, it's spring is like
Sprung.
on the verge, right? It's sprung, yeah, exactly. Just a good time too. I want to start with this story. I don't know if it's apocryphal. I haven't snoped it yet. But we still see that?
No.
All right. So it's a story about Einstein that someone asked him what his phone number was. And he said, what? Albert Einstein, yeah. Okay. Not Mimi Einstein, who I went to camp with, but Albert Einstein. So the person asked him what his phone number was. So what does Einstein do?
He starts styling.
No, he looks it up in the phone book because he doesn't know it. And the guy's like, "You're Einstein." He says, if I know where to access the information, I don't commit. I spend my memory. I use my brain cells for remembering things that otherwise I'm not going to be able to find that. And I tell you that story because it's not a punchline or something. I'm not putting on, but rather that for this class, for today's, what we're looking at these models, these taxonomies like Gary O'Leary, and we're looking at SWOHA, considering what Ray has to say, considering what and some of these models we're going to be looking at, or like Horowitz's the problems that Horowitz finds in trying to regulate conflict. I want you to think of these articles as like your phone book, that you want to know them well enough that you know where to access the information, right? If Einstein didn't know how to spell his name, it wouldn't really help him to have the phone book. So you want to be literate enough that you know where to look for it. But I do want these to be your go-to guides when you are, when you're doing your analysis, when when you get to that final paper. I mean, you need to go somewhere for the midterm. But don't worry about trying to understand every single tidbit and fact, right? I mean, there's the taxonomy, and then there are examples, and then there's like the big picture there. But whether or not, when is this this model going to be better than the second model for a given situation? It's okay not to delve into all of that, because that's like more theoretical, and that's more for when you actually apply it to a model and say, okay, let's look at a case study. What am I seeing here? Like, where is the taxonomy? And then once I understand where it is in the taxonomy, then I can go to look it up and say, okay, well, that's a taxonomy, this is where it belongs. These are the characteristics of this particular democracy. So then what does that say about the democracy? Is it following the model? Is it on the right path, or is it on the path where it's going to become more problematic? So then you have the tools to be able to think about, what might be the remedy for the problems that we see in this, or what are the obstacles in trying to remedy the problems that we recognize. Does that make sense? So I just I want to bear that in mind. And now have a question, like, let's say we take, let's say we wanted to look at a certain country. Let's say we were on a fact-finding mission. You're going to, I don't know, a place like Cyprus. You want to understand, you want to do a survey so you understand the nature of the ethnic conflict and how that might impact how that might impact the ability to have democratic governance. That would be something that's in line with the liberal ideals that we talked about last week. What would you need to know? What kind of things would you want to, what do you think are the important factors that you need to know, that you need to ask questions about in order to be able to do a good assessment of what kind of factors are relevant for the country? I want to think about questions first. You get what I'm getting at? That's all? Yeah.
Like in terms of what they would need to know about their own country, like their demographics?
Yeah, like that. You need to know the demographics, right? Why does that matter that you need to know the demographics?
Well, they can't really successfully pass policies if it doesn't align with what their culture is. Like I'm just thinking about how in South Korea they have very comprehensive policies about maternal paid time off, but nobody takes it because they're patriarchal.
Right.
So we need to know what your country's values are.
Okay. Oh, okay. So that's different. So they're demographics, but there's also values. Right. Okay. That's a separate issue. So yeah, the values definitely matter in terms of what is going to be the compatibility between the different groups, or whether or not a policy is going to fly. But also the demographics do matter, because if you think about it, it's a big difference if a country is saying, 90% one ethnic group and 10%, as opposed to 60-40 or 50-50, right? That's going to impact the relationships. It's going to impact how people perceive themselves. Do they see themselves as a minority, the majority, or a threatened majority? What other things would we want to think about?
Sorry, I didn't
Yes.
fully understand the question. Think about.
No. What questions will we know? If you're going to a country, what questions do you need to ask in order to be able to evaluate what might be a good remedy for, to manage, you're going to a country that all you know is that it's an ethnically divided country. What do we need to know in order to be able to remedy whatever problems they might be having? Yeah.
We need to know about their institutions and
Mhm.
regime.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Like the institutions matter because. Right. Yeah. Because
Or some other idea of
yeah.
like the history, when did the country become a country, and when was the split? When did the conflict start?
Well, maybe you can say like the history of the relationship. How much, how inimical do they see each other? What is the story they tell about each other? What is their, what is their perceived threat there? But institutions, but why do institutions matter?
because
Yeah.
you're constrained in a sense by what sort of bureaucratic or government institutions already exist.
Yeah.
And if you need to reform them, then that's a further obstacle.
Right, exactly, right. How robust are they? First of all, to what degree are they democratic at all? And if they're democratic, how liberal are they? What are the constraints? What's the balance of power? So, right, so these kinds of things you also have to know. Is there a commitment to democracy? We can understand that through the institutions. And if we do this one, the history of relationship, right? So there are things like, you could break it down even more, like, to what degree is there a sense of, threat between them? How inimical is the relationship there? Anything else? Yeah.
I don't know if this goes in with values, but like
Yeah.
cultural norms.
Yeah, I mean, I think we put together cultural norms there. Why do you distinguish between them?
I guess I think of values as something a little bit broader and
Yeah.
norms as applicable more to behavior.
Yeah, okay. All right, yeah, also with culture, I mean, you could throw in things like language, and religion and whatnot, and that can also make a difference, right, with the distribution there. And then there's one last one that I want to put in that is important, is that it's a little bit related to demographic, but it's significant in its own, is the geographic distribution. Right, very important, because it makes a big difference whether or not the group is concentrated in one particular area or if it's spread out across the country, right? Because, is this something that politically they can be isolated? Is it something that if they're living in their own, and then if you want to say limit, give them some kind of autonomy in areas there, what's the distribution, right? So how much of the majority would be affected by that? Right, so all these different things are going to the demographics, the geographics, the culture, all these things are combining to affect how these countries are going to organize themselves. And then once we do that, then we can have a better understanding, right? So that we need to know that. And then once we see how they organize themselves, we can see where does it match well and where are there mismatches? And are these mismatches the source of the strife that we see between the two, or multiple groups that we see going on here. So what I want to do now is I'm going to share some slides. Hold on a second. Yeah. Some of these things we've already covered, that we said, right? So, basic question is, what does make a democracy work, right? We talked last week about all the different components of what makes up a liberal democracy. But what makes a democracy work? And when do we see it functioning, and when do we see it floundering, as it were? What are the kinds of things we have to talk about?
I think it generally works when people have a similar ideology, when there's not as much internal strife.
Okay, right. So, well, that's an interesting point that you bring up here. So, like, I'll bring it up here because there are ideals, and then there is, like, what's the reality of it? So you think about like some form of unity, right? But something to bear in mind is you're right about that. But what's the problem with that? Like, do we ever really see that, and why not? Why don't we see that? I mean, because of society, yeah.
Just democracy, especially now, is people are becoming more integrated, such as women now have more rights than they did in the past.
Right.
It makes them want to have to be able to have an equal standing as men.
Yeah.
And so even if people share the same like background, the same national intent to be.
Yeah.
Some sort of human, we're always gonna have different political opinions.
Right.
And regardless, there's always going to be issues with if there's a law that gets passed.
Yeah.
Somebody's always gonna have a problem with it.
Right, right. Yeah, it's the nature of a complex system, right? A complex system is made, it's a system of relationships that everything, like, and it's a different level, there's a national relationship, national conversation, a regional and more local, communal. But, if there's fractal, it's a fractal situation that you zoom in on any smaller group and you're going to have certain similarities there. And there's always going to be people, that's just the nature of a complex system. Complex systems generate some low level of randomness. If it doesn't, if you have, people talk about unity as this wonderful thing, but unity is actually antithetical to a thriving system. Because the moment you have unity, then the system is going to become static and it's going to die. So you need to have a level of randomness. You need to have the people who are thinking differently, who are then able to help the system adapt when it needs to adapt, right? Sometimes systems don't adapt, there are plenty of countries and nations that have disappeared, they started off small, they grew large, and then they collapsed. And they collapsed in part because, while they were growing, there was tremendous unity, but they were unable to adapt to the necessary changes to a changing world. So that's necessary, and all the more so in a democracy, you're not going to have unity because people are going to have the right to vote. And it's interesting, Tony, you bring up the issue of women because that is a factor. But I think if you go back in time, there are always factors, right? Because you can see in British and American, all the democracies that go back a couple hundred years ago, even when it was just men, there was always division, right? I mean, you had 200 years ago, you had someone beating someone, another guy with a cane inside of Congress. So there's always going to be division. So the question is, how does a democracy live with the division and still work? So how does that? How does that work? Yeah.
Going back to institutions and
Yeah.
frameworks that allow us to have differences.
Right. So you need to have these frameworks or institutions, as it were, right? So that they allow differences. They allow for differences, or I would say, and they maintain trust. Right? People have to believe in the institution.
Yeah, and they believe that they have power and that they can make a change.
Yeah. So maybe say that they have faith in their own agency. To the degree that they want to, because there was a time when women didn't have the vote, and supposedly they were okay with that. And maybe many of them were because they were living in a society where they believed that was for the better of society, and so they gave up their energy. But eventually there were those who didn't have faith and they wanted to change it, and that's what brought the change to the system, was the fact that there was a sufficient number who said this isn't working for us and we need to change it there. So so those things are all parts. And there's one last one which has to do with the picture that I put up there is assimilation of new members, right? Because it's always going to be growing. You need to be able to assimilate them into the system so that they also buy into the values of it, even if they they might not have the same they might be from a different group, there might be differences between them, but somehow they get incorporated so that they buy into this here. This is actually a photograph, and it's a little bit hard because it's about 110 years old, this photograph, but this is, if you can see where you might see where it says school, it says pot. What it is, this is Ford, right? Like Henry Ford, like the Ford Motor Company. Okay, they had a lot of immigrants in Michigan back 100 years ago or so, 120 years ago. And they would have this ceremony. This was the Ford School melting pot. They would take immigrants who were, who were working for the Ford Motor Company,
They
That-
literally
that-
built a pot.
What?
They
And
literally.
they literally built a pot, exactly, yeah. And they thought, and it's funny, because this was at a time when, this was before the United States turned anti-immigrationist in the 1920s. And there was actually someone who, as racist as Ford was, he also understood that immigrants were good for society, but we want to integrate them into society. So they were taken to the school where they would learn English and whatever, and how to function in American society, adopt the values of that. And then the graduation ceremony was literally, these people would come in and they would be wearing their like traditional outfit from wherever they were coming from Germany or Italy. They would get into the pot and then they would all come out dressed as Americans, like with a little American flag. I mean, you laugh. Why do you laugh about this? This is real.
Yeah.
This is not a joke, yeah?
No, it's, I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous, but also the symbol of, I mean, it's.
Yeah, but
But it's.
yes, but it's an interesting thing though. It's like, that's the thing, is that I agree with you. There's something that seems kind of like ridiculous about this. The first time I read about it was in this book called Middlesex, and it's a fictional book, right? So I'm like, oh, this isn't real. Like, I mean, it's real. Until it was like, no, actually, they did. So yeah, but the thing is, it is. But on the other hand, if you think about it, there is also something almost sweet about it, in that they care so much about these people that they want to make them Americans, they want to bring them into the family. It's a lot better than, constantly, talking about an invasion and treating immigrants as enemies that need to be deported to these mega prisons where their human rights are going to be violated. So, now, and this is something that there's like a pendulum that goes through society of how you deal with that, right? No one would do this today, but it's worth considering. Maybe there's some aspects of it that would be a little bit less, I don't know, humiliating to their former identity that could be incorporated. I don't know, but it's just a different way of thinking about things, and at the time it worked for people. That would.
But I don't think the idea of like. Because I think like they have to forget about their like previous origin,
Yes.
and for me you can assimilate without like forgetting like who you are.
Yes,
And then
I
you can make a-
agree with you. And you're talking very much from a 21st century perspective, when we can FaceTime with our families back home. You know what I mean? Like, my grandfather, when he left Palestine in 1925, he came back one time in 1934. He stayed a year in Palestine to be with his family. He never saw his parents again, even though they died 8 years later. And then he made one more trip in 1960, and that was it. Right? My grandma, when my other grandparents left, what was Austria-Hungary, is, Romania, Slovakia, they never went back. They never saw their family again. So it's like, what do I need to speak Hungarian to my child for? So like when my dad was speaking Hungarian in school, they said, you got to stop that. And my grandparents were when we did that, because they so much wanted to assimilate into society, right? So it was a very different time. And that's also something to bear in mind, is that as we go along over society, and we know how democracy has been on the run for the last 20 years, different times is a different system, it calls for different solutions. So we need to think about that. And that can pose a challenge to how we try to think about things. We have to think about differently there. Right. So these are the things that we talked about, right? So like, what's the role of the individual in language, religion, cultural things, identity, geography, demography, the goals of the group, like that has to do with what their values are, the sense of threat. And also diasporas can also matter too, because there's a relationship there. It is very different. I'll give you an example of why diasporas make a difference. First of all, we see it in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Because there's a diaspora and that affects how the calculations that Israel makes. Sri Lanka is affected by the fact that there's like a Tamil diaspora. The Irish conflict was affected by the Irish diaspora, which had influence on the U.S. government. So diasporas also make a difference when you're talking about ethnic conflicts. Trying to resolve them by establishing democracies. I just want to get us out of the way a little bit. I don't want to do that. Okay. Go back there. Okay, so so then there are also questions about the role and the status of the minorities, because how the majority relates to them and treats them is going to impact the amount of influence they can have on society and their place if you're going to have, to the degree that you're going to have a democracy. So some of these things revolve around specific issues like citizenship, right? How do you award citizenship? Do you award it by there's the first one is just I don't pronounce so well, just solely. The first one has to do with is one of your, do you have a parent who is a citizen, right? So you pass citizenship through the blood. Your solely has to do with by birth, right? So if you are born somewhere, so like, and there are very few countries that do this, like the United States, where if you are born in the country, then you are actually, you gain citizenship. So for example, in Israel, right? So even someone who's Jewish, if their child is born in Israel, they don't automatically become an Israeli citizen. You have to ask for the citizenship. But then, the country can make a decision on how it awards it or how hard it is to obtain citizenship, right? So then there's a question is, can they claim citizenship elsewhere? In a democracy, this can make a difference, because in a democracy, there's a basic assumption that everyone should have a right to citizenship. So if they have nowhere else to go, then you need to award them citizenship. Maybe if they could claim citizenship, you don't have to give them, you don't have to award them citizenship. Can anyone think of any examples? Just, I don't, what countries I might have in mind, like a country where, you inherit a minority and they have no other citizenship anywhere else. Did you give them citizenship? A country where you become a country, become independent, and the people within your country have nowhere else to become citizen. Did you give them citizenship?
Palestinians in Jordan.
Well, Palestinians, I was thinking more about the Palestinians in Israel, right? Yeah. So right, when Israel became a country in 1948, right? So like if Israel, David Ben-Gurion wasn't so enthusiastic about giving citizenship. But if they didn't give them citizenship, and Israel wanted to be a democracy, well, where they had no, there was no other country at that time, because it wasn't Palestine, right? So they needed to do that. Yeah, Tom. Yeah. Well, see, that's the thing is that with the Native Americans, right? They didn't get citizenship until 1924, 25, right? And they didn't. And the claim that the United States made was what? He said, well, they have their name, they form these nations, right? So they were saying they're part of the Indian nation. Now, they didn't have independence, but also this is also the United Nations, I think, changed the game, about citizenship. And so you could disenfranchise entire people and no one batted an eye. It wasn't until the United Nations came along. Even the League of Nations didn't necessarily make that much of an impact because not everyone was in it. But since United Nations, it's like a norm that everyone deserves citizenship, has a right or has a basic right to citizenship. So yeah, so they denied it, but they denied it based on the fact that, well, they are a separate nation. We make treaties with them, right? Okay, the United States might not respect those treaties, but they still made treaties with them as if they were, another nation there. But eventually it was I think recognized within the United States that, well, they're part of the United States. They're not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere else. So they gave them citizenship. Yes.
Eve is waiting on Zoom.
Oh.
To,
Oh, she needs to be admitted in. Oh,
you think?
okay. Hold on a second. Wait, I'm just gonna stop sharing here so I know what the hell I'm doing. Because there's someone else who's running the thing.
Okay.
Oh, she might be. Wait, you know what? Because this is a special meeting here. Wait, hold on a second. I'm sorry about this. We're gonna have to
Oh, this doesn't match
pause
the link
here.
that I sent.
Yeah, it's a different link. Yeah. Wait, can you tell Eve I'm gonna email the link?
Mhm.
I completely forgot about this. So I'm just gonna do that. I'm just gonna send it out to everyone here. Obviously, you can. I'll ignore this. I'm just gonna put it here. Can someone also let Zoof know, because she's what?
Mhm.
Well, I did a terrible job of. I think my hand was like one key off. No, yeah, okay. Okay, good enough. Okay. All right, so let everyone in the group know that if they want to get in here, I completely forgot about that. Okay, I'll have to watch. It's gonna be on YouTube, actually. I'm gonna think this is gonna go viral. Send it to all your friends and whatever like that. My goal is 1 million hits. Okay. So let's get back to this. Well, that's it. I'm gonna do it. Okay. Right, so examples where they claim citizenship elsewhere are like Sri Lanka. When they became a country, there were Indian Tamils there, so they denied them citizenship because they said they can take it from India. Estonia and Latvia, when they became independent, they took the Russian citizens, said, well, they're still Russian, so they don't have to be Estonian and Latvian. So and that was a way that these countries could preserve their democracies with minorities that they found problematic for various reasons that we'll get into later in the semester. So it is possible to deny citizenship to a group of people and still make a claim to democracy. You might come under criticism, but you can still strive to be a democracy. Yeah.
Well, when we talk about like the two-state solution,
Yeah.
I think when Israelis talk about it, there's a assumption or an argument,
Yeah.
depending on who you're talking to, that like when there will be a Palestinian state, then that means the end of the right of return, like they're mutually exclusive, because if you be a citizen of the Palestinian
Right.
state, you're not gonna come back to Israel.
Right.
That's the end of that conversation.
Right.
But when Palestinians talk about it, they don't treat them as mutually exclusive, like it's an and, they treat them both and.
Well, I mean, that's
depending on
that's a
your
different issue because when Israelis and Palestinians talk about peace, they're talking about different things. Israelis are talking about security, is the number one thing. Palestinians are thinking about justice. For Palestinians, justice includes not only being citizens, but also maintaining the right to return to their original home in Israel, even if it would mean that they would be able to vote in Israel, that they would vote for, like, the Palestinian Authority. But they want to see,
So you're separating the franchise from citizens,
Yeah,
or the.
well,
so
where you're
you
living,
live
whatever, yeah, and also, I mean, Israel's a very, very unique case with, the whole campaign. Well, in terms of the citizenship, that's certainly, an issue there. Oh, now she wants to come in. Okay, Ava. Okay. You in, Ava? Sorry about that, I forgot. Okay, all right, then there are other questions. Should they enjoy collective rights?
Мирон идут смотреть.
What? Wait, was that over the Zoom or was that over the loudspeaker?
That was, that was.
Very weird. Okay, right, because anyway, okay, let's not worry about that here. Okay, so collective rights. Collective rights are important because there are different ways that you can approach democracy. So the most extreme liberal form of liberal democracy, which is the French system, is known as Jacobin democracy. The idea there is that it is equality for everyone, and no one has any special rights, right? So there was even a famous quote by a French politician when after the French Revolution in 1806, the French emancipated the Jews under Napoleon. But the motto was, as French citizens, they'll have, all rights, and as Jews, they'll have no rights, right? So everything is based on the fact that you're French, and that's how you're defining the identity of the nation. So it's, so you get nothing as a Jew there. So, but you can say, well, collective rights is something that I might deny it if I want an extreme liberal model, but I might also say, well, I'm going to, for whatever reason, take away certain individual rights on the liberal, on the liberal model, but I'm going to award them collective rights. And we'll get into that why there would be an interest in awarding collective rights to a minority there. There's questions about language, what is the official language? And there are multiple options. It isn't an either or. Is it either the main language, or is it, do we recognize all the languages, or only one language, or no languages? It's also, there are many countries where English is the official language, even though it's not the mother tongue of any of the individual groups there. So language becomes a tool of how you manage your ethnic divisions within the democratic system there. And then this question here is about, are we trying to assimilate culture? Are we trying to create one great, super identity for everyone who's in the country? Or are we, or does the system reinforce identity? Is identity important to the dominant ethnic group to the degree that they would rather enforce it and rather not have integration and allow people to be minorities and stay minorities, right? Which is the opposite, right? With Henry Ford, they were saying, okay, let's take all these different people and let's all have one identity. Whereas in a country like Israel, for example, there is no interest. Not only is there no interest on the Jewish side, there's also no interest on the Palestinian side, which is different than, say, like in the United States, where there might have been, there were a lot of Blacks who wanted to assimilate into American culture and they weren't allowed to. So here it could be that it's mutual in terms of reinforcing identity. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, all right, so let's move on here. So I think I mentioned this last time, but I just wanted to review it again, is that there are different ways, there are different mechanisms that are available for addressing ethnic grievances. Clearly through the legislature is one way, because of the laws that you're going to pass, and also whether or not you're going to have representation. That if there are ethnic minorities who feel they're being underrepresented, you can make sure that they have some kind of guarantee, because every system is going to be different, right? If you make something proportional, it could be that that they'll get some representation. But if you do something like a district first past the post, which is a problematic way of doing things, if a minority, again, right, it depends on whether or not the minority is concentrated in one area or if it's spread out. If it's concentrated in one area, they'll be able to get representation. But if they're spread out, then they'll be represented nowhere, because there'll always be a minority in every single district there. So you need to think about what does the legislature look like, and how is it going to reflect the minority, and to what degree you want that, right? There are countries where they have raised the minimum threshold precisely so that they can disenfranchise minority groups. In fact, even in Israel, the threshold now is 3.25%. Right, it used to be 2%. Why was it raised from 2 and 3 to 3.25? Well, there was a politician, Avigdor Lieberman, and he got the idea. He looked at it and he saw there were 4 Arab parties that seemed they could never get their act together, and each one got a little bit over 2%. So they were all getting into the Knesset. So he said, well, if we raise it to 3.25, then none of them were getting, because none of them gets more than 3%. And then that led to the creation of the joint list, right? So it's and that's the thing, is in a dynamic, complex system, you can think very optimistically and say, okay, this is the reality, so I'm going to change the reality this way to get the desired result. But then you get an unexpected result, because then the people that you're trying to affect, they also see the system changing, and then that changes their behavior, and then they change, and then the system changes again. And in fact, Lieberman almost didn't make it into the Knesset one time because of the very law that he created, the amendment that he pushed for. So that's legal representation. Then there's the judicial system, which is extremely, extremely important. Cannot overemphasize it, that the judicial system is there precisely to put a check on power, both on the executive and on the legislative branches. And as I mentioned, when politicians have tried to take democracies and use them and weaponize them against minorities, the judicial system is one of the first, gatekeepers to fall. And then finally, as I said, is that they're offering collective rights and privileges there, that if a minority has, to the degree that it has grievances and has desires of how it wants to be treated, the central government can decide on giving these, you mentioned collective rights or privileges, so that they'll feel that, to address those specific issues that are of concern to the minority. Usually, if it doesn't come at too heavy a price for the ethnic group that's in control there. Okay, now let's look at the different taxonomies, and eventually I also want to bring in the discussion about Ray. But let's first do this and keeps getting in the way. And I can just minimize it. Trust that Ava's coming back. Okay, so first of all, there's McGarry's and O'Leary's taxonomy, and as you recall, it has nothing to do with taxes. Right? It's about it's based on the system, the scientific system that began in the 17th century of trying to classify organism with like with like. This is different when you're doing a political taxonomy. We have to bear in mind that political systems are dynamic and complex and they change over time, right? So a country can go from being, can switch between policies, or it can enforce one policy and then change over time and abandon that policy. So it's really, when you're trying to do a taxonomy, you're taking a look at these countries. It's not quite like, like and like, because the character, there are so many different characteristics that go into a political system. It's not like a laboratory where you can do an experiment and run that experiment several times and get the same result, because we're talking about living, breathing systems that are changing over time. But we can try to get some kind of like a snapshot of a system at a certain period of time and see what are the things that are similar characteristics between the different groups there. So I put these on the board so we can get an idea of some of these are. So as I mentioned last week when I was introducing this, they break it down into two different approaches. One where you're trying to eliminate the differences, and one where you're managing them, which I think, not always fun to binary, but that pretty much covers it, because you're either trying to get rid of it or if you're not. The moment that you're not getting rid of it, so you need to manage it. So those are the two different ones here. And what I also put down here is how they're compatible. So the ones that are not compatible with democracies, we're going to skip over them because obviously we don't do that. Although it is worth considering that could you be pushing a democracy if there's a democracy that's on that has had a history of very bad relations? Are you doing something that might push it, push the dominant group into a place where they would contemplate doing something terrible there? But obviously that's not a solution there. What we do get are the last two are more compatible, and this one is the one that's the more let's say more practical, in the sense that if you're talking about partition and succession to resolve your differences, that basically ended right there, right? So you don't have to manage there. It doesn't really matter if you're a democracy or not afterwards, because you have no responsibility for that other group there. And there's also they're very few and far between, and they tend not to be with the let's say the blessing of the international community. The international community pretty much favors keeping countries together at any cost. Maybe that's a mistake. You look like various countries that have had either civil wars, invasions, whatnot, but there are. So there are a couple examples, like Bangladesh, which had a civil war, and Eritrea had a civil war, but that didn't, but that's, and also remember, this is a taxonomy of regulating ethnic conflict. So it doesn't have to be a democracy here, obviously there. There is one example of you could say secession within a democracy, that happened, in recent history, and that would be Slovakia breaking away from Czechoslovakia, which is why we today have Czech Republic and Slovakia. But like I said, it's so rare that I don't think we should spend too much time trying to, inquiring about it. But this one is integration and assimilation, because this is something that we see countries trying to do in terms of regulating their ethnic conflict or potential conflicts. And so that's where I would want to sit with for a while there. It is a challenge, right? What's challenging about assimilation today? What is different about assimilation today as opposed to a policy 100 years ago, 120 years ago? What a different world, right? You're talking about.
That the assimilation back then was sort of removing your previous identity, and here you can have both of them.
Yeah, because we live in a world there's much more migration going on today than there were 100 years ago, and there's also much more abilities to maintain contact with the home country there, and so it's very, it's a different world. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen though, and there can be consequences. So for example, Rwanda has been engaging in an assimilation policy, but the price of that has been that Rwanda is, if it was flirting with being a democracy 30 years ago, it's no longer, it's not even close to being a democracy. It might be the darling of, the Western world, and people love, going there for trips and whatnot, and they're happy how clean it is and all that stuff. But any democracy, that's what it isn't though. Botswana does try to do that. Botswana does have a policy of trying to engage in integration and assimilation while maintaining its characters of democracy, and we're going to cover Botswana there. So it is, I raise it because it is possible to do it, but it is a challenge. Turkey does it, but Turkey has has gone in between being a democracy and a dictatorship. Now it's technically a democracy, but it's barely hanging on under Erdogan there. And so assimilation is something that is difficult. You take a country like the United States, and there is integration there. But what is the downside of integration and assimilation? I mean, it sounds like a good thing, right? Because then if you can accomplish that, so then there's going to be more equality, between the people by eliminating those differences, right? So everyone will be treated equal. But what's the downside of the integration and assimilation model, even if you're maintaining a democracy there?
Well, if it's really an assimilation model, then you're using the individuality of the supposed cultures that are making up the different percentages of the population.
Right. You're losing diversity,
Yeah.
right? And losing diversity is something that is not, diversity is associated with growth in societies. And so you're hurting yourself by eliminating those things, by eliminating diversity. Anything else? Lots to come to mind that we see. Yeah.
I think there's a bit of a chance of, if the population that's immigrating is inclined to vote for less democratic things, then it can change the direction of the country politically a lot.
Okay. So you're saying the immigrant group can change there. Okay, that's a possibility there. And what might be another way of looking at it where you get a problem there? That's a problem with the minority, but what about with the majority? Which kind of relates to, we'll be talking about it in the next class with Taylor, but yeah.
Maybe if it's not successful, people will put their community first, and after the citizenship, the nationality. For example, if Jews are not well integrated in France, they will put their community first, the Jews, after French people.
Right. You're talking about within the Jewish community or within the French community? The Jewish community, the non-Jewish community.
So the Jewish French community.
Okay,
if
the
Jews are not well integrated, they will, or even Jews who are not French, they will prefer to be with Jews after with French people. Okay. All right. So
that's so you have the alienation that the minority can feel if they're not able to successfully integrate. That's one way. But going the other direction now,
There could be backlash from the majority as well.
Yeah.
I actually talked about it in my reading response, because this is
Yeah.
the reading that I read. I talked about France and their like cultural laws. They
Mhm.
specifically have a law in the radio in which 40% of the songs have to be in French.
Yeah,
And there was a lot of backlash from French artists when they said, okay, no, we also want to play music in English. So like,
Mhm.
they may also not agree with the assimilation laws.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's pushback in many different ways, because the question is, how do you do assimilation? And assimilation can be through, integration laws, integration policies of like, school busing, like having integrated schools and whatnot. Because education is, is at the heart of assimilation, of integration. And there can be pushback from the majority. They don't like that. They don't want that, right? They can feel a threat. That has been going on, you can look at the United States, because the United States has been a melting pot. But the original concept of what it meant to be white was really about being Scotch, Scotch British, that was being white, right? When Germans, like, a fun fact about the United States, why were there abortion laws on the books, like from, there were no abortion law books, like in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Why did there start being abortion laws? There started being abortion laws in the States because the white Protestants from Britain and that saw these German Catholics immigrating in the mid-19th century. And the white Protestant women were having fewer babies, and the German Catholic women were having lots of babies, and they were afraid they were going to be overtaken by these papists, as they called them back then. So they said, okay, let's ban abortion, so that way we'll force the Protestant women to have more babies, so that we can win the demographic war with the German Catholic. But nowadays, right, to be, there's no distinguishing there, right? And it was over time, right? Then there was the Irish and the Italians, right? No dogs, no Irish, in this establishment. And it's the black. So there are always these barriers, and there's always a pushback, and there's always a cultural war going on, right? People talk about a cultural war today, but there have been cultural wars going on for 2 centuries practically in these democracies. They've just changed over time, and then as the minority integrates into the majority, so then they turn around and they start treating the other people. It's like the ladder effect, right? You get pulled up the ladder, and then you pull the ladder for the other people there. Even in the United States, for example, 1/3 of third generation Hispanics, immigrants, consider themselves white, right? So, and then you ask yourself, why are they voting for a party whose leader attacks Spanish people as criminals? Is because they don't see themselves as Spanish anymore. They see themselves as white. So they've changed their identity there, but it doesn't mean that there isn't pushback on that. Okay, so that's integration and assimilation there. Then there are the managing differences. And as we see, the managing differences in general are more compatible with democracy, although hegemonic control is problematic. Okay, and why is that? Right? What is hegemonic control about? Hegemonic control is about the host, the dominant ethnic group saying, you will never, you will never take power here, right? You might not even be able to share in the power, right? Take Israel, for example, there wasn't an Arab party that was part of a coalition until 2022. And the person who agreed to that, Naftali Bennett, has said that if he gets another chance of forming a government, he would not include Arabs in that. So, they're very much on the edge there. So you are engaging in this hegemonic control to say that, there is a inherent connection between the ethnic group and the country that it resides, right? You're distinguishing the types of citizenship because there's like a civic type of nationalism and there's an ethnic type of nationalism, right? Yes.
But
Yes.
it doesn't mean that the control have to be under the majority, hidden minority, is it? Because already actors also.
Well, it could, in the case of South Africa, it was hegemonic control by a minority. So there's one dominant ethnic group, but it tends, except for South Africa, it tends to be the majority that engages in the hegemonic control, right? But they make decisions based on that. So and now again, Gary and O'Leary are talking about any ethnic conflict. If we make it more specific about democracies, that's why I say it's with restrictions, you can have hegemonic control as a democracy, but it's going to, as we'll see, it's going to diminish the quality of your democracy, and it's also going to make your democracy more vulnerable to losing its status as a democracy. Because if you perceive the minority as a threat that should not be controlled, so then that could lead to temptation, among people, among the majority who feel that, that they're too equal to each other, and we have to have more discrimination against the minority group, and we have to push them down. So it's more vulnerable. That's why I said it's restrictions, because it's necessarily diminished type of democracy. Like I said, Estonia, right? So the only way they could have their democracy was by depriving Russians of citizenship who were living in the country. Now they've managed to do it, and they've done it quite well. And Estonia is seen as a very, has gone from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. But not without a price to its democracy. And it's been moving in the direction of increasing the franchise. But it increases what Estonia does is Estonia kind of plays it's a little bit of this, is that Estonia is trying to, nudge Russians to assimilate more towards Estonian democracy, even as they engage in hegemonic control. That's contradictory, because one policy maintains the identity and one policy tries to eliminate the differences there. So it's a tricky game when you're trying to engage in hegemonic control and be a democracy at the same time. And there are more examples here, but those are the main ones, like Sri Lanka. There are some that are becoming India's in the direction of ethnic democracy. Okay, but that's hegemonic control. Then there's arbitration. And arbitration I'm going to skip over because it's very unique cases that I don't think there are any cases now that would be amenable to assimilation there. They're part of the taxonomy simply because South Tyrol, which is part of Italy, it used to be part of Austria and became part of Italy after World War II, and it's a heavy Austrian population there. They have some very awesome organic apples that I get. There's a farm near us, and you buy organic apples from South Tyrol. So they still have a South Tyrolean identity there, but so there's the arbitration comes in that when there's a conflict between the locals and the government, so then there's an arbitration process which involves a third party that is part of the decision-making process, and Austria has a say in the fate of South Tyrol there. And Åland is the same thing, is that it's basically a Finnish enclave within Sweden, and you're just not really going to have it anywhere else. Maybe someone might think that maybe for the Palestinian, this is something that could be explored for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe arbitration would be a possible idea, but no one's really explored it. There's a thought out there to think about there if that would be even possible. But I'm not going to focus we're not going to be looking at any case studies beyond that, because they're very unique in their character. And also between countries that are not at war, so it's a lot easier to do it there. But we can't talk about these two because we will be dedicating entire weeks and case studies too. So the first one is the idea of cantonization and federalism, which are both. Which are different from each other. They're similar in what regards? What is it about? And this might be more familiar territory, but cantonization and federalism. What does that mean? What does either one say to you? Anyone try to articulate? Don't have to be worried about getting it wrong. Just try to articulate what either of them might be. Yeah.
I mean, technically, the United States.
It is. It's very much a federal government. Yeah. So what makes it a federal government?
The idea that power is relegated mainly to the states, except when they have to come together in order to make decisions that affect the national interest. That transcend all of the individual states. In practice, it doesn't really work that way anymore so much in America, but that's the
basic idea, right? Yeah, the main idea is that you have a central government and you have local governments, and the two parties agree to share competencies with each other. There are some things that you delegate and you say, this is only for the national government. This is only the, only the states or the regions or provinces, whatever you want to call them. And it's legislated through there's some kind of legal framework, generally, it's constitutional, which means that you can't just easily revoke it. Right, and that's what's important about it, is that you're legislating this in such a way that the central government is ceding power to the regions or states, whatever you want to call them, so that they can have, control over certain areas that are of importance to those groups there. So, so certainly if you're talking about a country that is federal states that is ethnically based, you want to be able to, that they will have a voice. You could take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria, has broken up and it's changed over time, but now there are 36 different states, and the states, have different demographic composition, and based on the demography of each state, they're able to make decisions about themselves in terms of, what is the main language that the state is functioning in, and who's getting the resources, and what, how you regulate the relationships. So you break it up into a smaller group. The difference between that and cantonization, the distinguishing is that cantonization, first of all, is, you could break it up. You can just keep going smaller, smaller until you just get to a group that has control over itself, where it's, into a homogeneous group. For one, right? Because in a federal arrangement, for example, and this happens in Nigeria too, is that sometimes you can divide a state, you can divide the country up in ways that you have a balance, right? And I'm gonna come back to that question there, but I just want to make the distinction, and then I'm going to talk about a balance. So with cantonization, you say, okay, let's break it down to the smallest unit where a group of people have their own identity, their own, shared culture and values, and then they can make decisions for themselves. So that's one aspect of it. The other is that it's not necessarily rooted in the Constitution. So you are giving, you're ceding this power to this group, but you have the right to take it away if you want to. You could, the central government could revoke that power for whatever reason that they choose. So it's not anchored in the Constitution in the way federalism is. Now, to get back to the division part, because this is also something that needs to be thought about. But what does it matter? What are the possible repercussions of dividing up if you're breaking up into federal units? If you're breaking it up in such a way that you have a more homogeneous group, or you have a more heterogeneous group, what are the what might be the implications if you think about that? What can be the repercussions of having it where it's mixed as opposed to like an ethnic enclave that is like 90-100% one group? Yeah.
Well, risks of having heterogeneous groups is that the minority rights aren't represented because the majority dominates.
Okay, so that's one. So that's a danger.
Yes.
Is that right? So then the minorities dominate everywhere, and they do that there. Is there a possible benefit though? Because for each one there's a downside and an upside. So that's the downside. What could be the possible benefit?
It would also allow the groups to mix, which would hopefully create like a larger community and mean that their interests become more mutually aligned.
Yes. Yeah, if they feel they have shared interests, and if there's, it's been shown, like this is something, when you look at a federal system in the United States, where there's this process of gerrymandering. Is everyone familiar with the term gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is when you carve up districts in such a way to favor one political party over another party. So what they found is that in areas where you gerrymander, so then that leads to more extremism, right? Because if the one party knows that they're always going to win the election, so then the most radical person can run for that office and know that they're going to win in the general election there. Whereas if you have a balance, it forces moderation, right? So even though there's a danger there, but if they're represented, it could also mean that actually things will be better because you need to work with each other. We'll talk about that with the centripetal and consociational forces there. So that's that. And then the flip side. the advantage and disadvantage of having the, a homogeneous district is one is that, okay, they get to decide for themselves and they're not gonna like, make anyone really upset. But on the other hand, they could be more radical. And so, and if they're more radical, that could create problems both on the local level and on the national level. You have these instances where democracies where you have, groups that become secessionists because since there's only their group is represented, you have the person with the most radical idea. If the most radical idea is secession, that's the person who's going to end up representing your district at the national level, which is going to affect the relationship there. And then the last one is consociationism and power sharing. Power sharing, which we're going to talk about. And again, it's the kind of thing that consociationalism is thought of something that's legislated power sharing. It just, it might not be anchored in constitutional law there. But the idea is that you guarantee the minority certain powers. So, or certain representation. So for example, you might have proportional representation, and you might have an allotted system where you guarantee a certain amount of representation. You could say that they will get at least 5% of the seats, or in Lebanon, for example, right? The Christians, even though they're not half of the population anymore, they get half the seats. Okay, so that leaves it there. And as we know, that can lead to problems. In Belgium, for example, every cabinet has to have members of both ethnic groups, right? There are Walloons who are French speaking, and the Flams, the people from Flanders. And so who speak Dutch, or I should say they speak Flemish, which is like Dutch. And so there's always going to be representation of both of those in the cabinet. But as we see, so it's definitely compatible with democracy, but it can lead to problems because one is that it isn't necessarily, it's not fully democratic because you don't have full representation, right? So there might be members of the majority who feel that they are underrepresented at the cost of the minority representation. And as we'll see from our work, we'll be talking about it in the next class, it leads to this problem of immobilization because if both sides are guaranteed power, there's less motivation for compromising, right? So in the system here, where people, are in a district, in a mixed district, they are incentivized to make a compromise and be moderate. You don't necessarily have that in the consociational system. So there's that. There's also things like minority veto, that they might have the power to say that certain laws can't be passed over their head. You can have something where there's you can require that there has to be a minimum support from the minority in a certain number of districts in order for a candidate to be elected a national candidate or law to pass. So there are all kinds of things you build in to make the minority feel like it can't be completely disenfranchised. Yes.
The other articles about central title is the same.
Yeah. He's talking about consociationism. So we're going to talk more. We're going to go big in the second half today.
This is
Yes.
the big.
This is just the taxonomy. This is just saying that this is possible and how can we identify, if we look at it, we take our magnifying glass to democracy and we look at it very closely and we say, oh yes, this is consociationalism, because you look at Belgium and they say that constitutional change that affects a certain minority group needs at least 25% support of the minority group, right? So they can, it's like a backstop there. And that has worked in a way there. So if you see it, then you know that this is consociational. So there are just the different telltale signs of the word. So if you see those things, if you see like these grand coalitions with multiple ethnic groups, and you see proportional representation, and you see minority veto, it's consociationalism, right? Okay. Power sharing can be a little different. Power sharing, we often see it like after a civil war, they say, okay, like, you have election and the winner is president and the loser is vice president. I'm like, good, because it's like, and then that leads me to Bob Ray, right? Okay. It's just like, could you imagine the United States if they said, okay, well, Trump won and Harris lost, so Trump will be president and Harris will be vice president, you know what I mean? Like, they actually tried that at the beginning, the very beginning of the Republic. The first couple of elections, the loser ended up, second place was that. They did away with that after a couple of elections, because that was like not a recipe for success. So yeah.
Would it also fall under
Yeah.
power sharing when places are like, we're gonna have a Muslim president for 3 years and then,
Yeah, I mean, that's like Nigeria does that. When
Yeah.
Nigeria says we alternate, there's a president from the north for 2 terms, president from the south for 2 terms. So that way you feel some kind of fair representation going on there, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that might be a little bit different, because I think power sharing is where they actually they're sharing executive power at the same time. Which might be a little bit different from alternating, but, yeah. No. But, those are different ideas of different ways of doing power sharing, Alex, yeah.
It seems like every system
Yes,
eventually trends towards not being able to compromise. Like, even the systems that try to institute structural compromise or structural tendencies towards compromise, it's like,
Yeah.
they'll eventually get warped.
yes.
So how do we fix? I don't know.
Well, no, it is a good question,
Systems
I
that build in, systems
yes.
that build in balance, there's no incentive to compromise because why should we compromise if we
Yes.
don't need to fight for our position? And systems where like,
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, that you are pointing out a problem. This is a challenge of any democratic system, precisely because they are a complex system, that the circumstances are going to change and they have to be dynamic. But when you make laws, that's what's problematic about making laws is that the laws eventually become outdated. And the question is, how are you able to adapt it, right? And if they lead to grievances, so then, like you say, the one thing that's always consistent is that the party in power always wants to expand their power, right? They expand the executive power, and the party that's in opposition wants to restrict it. Right, because they fear there's you need, we talked about this before, right? You need to have faith, you need to have trust. But part of having these political differences is that there is a certain lack of trust. Right, if they have a different idea of how things get done, you start questioning their motives, and then you want to restrict them as much as possible. And the other ones feel like any attempt to restrict them is unfair, because it's like, well, I'm in power, I get to decide what's going to happen. So it is, but that's the challenge. That how do we make these systems dynamic? They're not really. They're very laws are very animistic when they're just not flexible there. We could think about ideas about how could we make them more dynamic. I think that's a good exercise. And there are some radical ideas. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast. Maybe if you know Malcolm Gladwell or his revisionist history, right? There are experiments that have been done not at a national level but on local level, that the most effective form of election is what? Trick question. It's not having election. It's actually getting rid of elections and having lotteries. And you just basically say, anyone who wants to be a leader, put your name in the hat, and we'll pick someone else. Why do lotteries, like at least at local, I'm talking about like running, like student councils and universities and things like that. Why might lottery systems seem to work better than elections? So, yeah, it's all.
Chance of winning, right?
Yes.
Like, for example, how the 2016 election in the United States went, even though the majority wanted it one way, it didn't go that way.
Right. But it didn't go that way, right? But the person who won it, he treated as if now he has all the power, right? When you have elections and you win elections, right? And then you start thinking about, how do I win the next election? You get into the mindset of, how can we maintain power? We maintain power by like suppressing the other side and doing things that are going to favor us, right? I heard, I'm X now. I don't know how many of you are on X, but like, you know, journalists, like, even if you know, like, originally the algorithms was, you know, you want to listen to right-wing media, you'll get right-wing media. You want to listen to left-wing media. And now it's like X is always giving you pro-Trump messages, right? There's no, you know, the algorithm is not based on what you want, it's based on what Elon Musk wants and what Donald Trump wants. Yeah. So it's like very, it's just, it's anti-democratic. But so when you win the election, you have a sense of privilege, and then you start trying to protect your power. When you are elected randomly by lottery, and there are Native American societies that have done this too, you feel the gravitas of the office. You say, wow, this is an honor and a privilege for me to do this, and I better do a good job, because since it's a lottery, what does that mean? When my term is over, I have an equal chance of getting elected as anyone else, which means probably not. So I have to be nice to other people, because they're probably going to be in charge of me in another 4 years' time. So, you know, there are different ways that people have tried to deal with inequalities, to address them, to make people act in a more just way. I have other stories, but I'm going to skip them for now. But I'll tell you about the Jubilee in ancient Sumeria another time. Okay, Sami Smulah's model. Right. So what Sami Smulah does is he does it a little bit differently from the taxonomy here. He gives a model of he's tried to classify, you know, taking the chaos of all these groups, trying to make an order of them by saying, okay, specifically with democracies, what is the range of democracies here, right? So you know, what is the character of the state and whatnot, and these different criteria that if you look at it, you go through a checklist and say, okay, yes, no, and then you can find out which one you are, right? So let's just take Israel before I go through the whole list here. But you have this in your article, so you don't need to talk about it. But let's take Israel, for example. If we wanted to know where Israel was, so let's say here, in Israel, is there equality of individual rights?
Well, what part of Israel are you talking about?
We're talking about within the 67 borders, okay?
Okay.
Within the 67, not in the West Bank, which is not production and all that. Okay. Yeah, yes, but there are qualifications, because there are certain places where there is some kind of discrimination, but to a large extent, people are basically equal under the law. There was a study, stop me if I told you this one already before, but there was a study that was done of judges who were giving out, like in traffic court in Israel, and they're giving out traffic violations. Did you guys want already? No? Okay. And they were trying to measure, trying to see what was the correlation between who was getting worse punishments for the same offenses. And what was the expectation? Arabs get punished more than Jews, right? That was not the case. What was the biggest fact? What was the biggest correlation in the
One day.
Yeah, how long have it been since they last eaten? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in that sense, they do have it to a large extent there. But there are places like, for example, swimming pools and things, because of the system that Israel has in terms of Jewish communities and whatnot, there is discrimination. There are certain places Arabs don't have access to. So in those senses, it's not full. So it is to a large extent. Okay, so that is okay. Now, okay, collective rights. Are there collective rights in Israel? Do minorities have any collective rights in Israel? No. They do, yes. Like what?
No.
Well, no, because everyone can vote. That's not a collective right. That's like an individual. It's an individual right. Everyone.
Arabic being.
What is something that only Arabs have a right to? That
To go pray peacefully.
Well, no, everyone does it. Everyone has a right to do that there, but yeah.
I don't know if this is exactly a right, but it's like they're not obligated to join the army.
Yeah, no, that's not necessarily a right there, but because that becomes probably because that's a basis for discrimination against them there. But how about getting married by a, if you're a Muslim, you can get married in a Muslim court, or if you're Jews, you can get married in a Jewish court, right? You don't have to go. You can choose your own. You can choose your own. Religious judge, or if you have a civil suit, you can choose to go through the civil court, or you can go through a religious court. Okay, so that's a collective right that is owned, that is owned by them. For Muslims, it's like, isn't that Saturday is the national holiday for Jews, right? But Friday, but Muslims can take off Friday, Christians can take off Sunday. So those things are collective rights that they hold. Even for the Jews, the funny thing is that there's like 12 different Jewish holidays over the course of the year, and then there's like 12 Muslim holidays. So then they turned to the Jews and they said, well, you guys you should get 12 days off that you can take that are like paid work days for you. And they're like, we're Jews, we don't have any holidays. And we're like, well, make them up. So they made up like 12 days that they have there. So if you're Jews, you can take those 12 days off and you get paid vacation. So those are the things, and these things are legislated there. So, okay, so in other words, Israel's here, Israel might be consociational, right? But they're not these other ones here. Equality of collective rights. Are the collective rights equal between the different groups? Definitely not, right? Okay, there are a lot of things where Jews have many more rights. Give an example. My kids go, my kids went to university, and my son's at Hebrew University right now. There is a program called Nefesh Yehudi, right? If you are a Jew, you can do this thing where it's a Jewish enrichment program, and then you will get a 5,000 shekel subsidy for university. Okay, there is no means Jewish soul. There is no Druze soul program, no Christian soul program, no Muslim soul program like that. The government gives, for example, Jews have right to, Jews have the right to immigrate here on a ticket that's paid for by the government. No one else does. Jews have, these paid subsidized trips to go to Poland, right? But the Palestinians don't get a trip to get to see like where their village was destroyed in 1948. So there are things where Jews enjoy privileges that they don't. So collectively, Jews enjoy many more privileges than non-Jews. Oh, yeah, question?
Yeah, just in terms of the scholarship for universities.
Yeah.
My family did mention that Arabs usually get a lot of scholarships like it comes with Harvard University that is not qualified for Jewish students from the government.
Yeah, I mean, there is a specific thing there, but I mean, I wouldn't say there's nothing like that, but I mean, there's a lot more for Jews because also Jews, like, through the army, both my kids' educations were paid for by the army. There. That is something that they're trying, but I think, are you sure that isn't like with, it might be like Palestinians who like take these special courses to learn Hebrew? Or are you talking about Israeli Arab citizens? Yeah. No, it could be. I'm not saying there's nothing out there, but on balance, I mean, it's been shown in terms of like your tax shekel, Jews get much more, back than non-Jews do because of all the investments in the Jewish community there. So that's there. The state obviously is not neutral. Okay, right? Assimilation policy. The state is not interested in assimilation policy, and assimilation rate. It can vary, but it can be fairly, 0 or close to 0 there. So if you look at this, you say, okay, so what does Israel most look like on this thing? Which one? Yeah, I think democracy. Yeah. So and you could do that. You could do it with any country, and you could do it there. But in terms of like what he's trying to show is that he's trying to build this continuum from more democratic to less democratic here. And now he first talks about the individual liberal, which is like he talks about it as an ideal. And for me, the easiest way to just think about that is that the individual liberal ideal is that if everyone could make a decision, and it's like a full participatory democracy where everyone is making a decision on every single issue there. But that is something that would just be like too much randomness for the system. You can work on a small level, like the family level, or maybe in a church or synagogue. But to have something like that on a state level is just not practical. And so we don't really talk about it, even though that's the most. So then we take the second best, which is Republican liberal, which is where you are voting for representatives who then, who then speak out in the interest and vote in your interest on your behalf. And it is a more civic-minded, here's a civic, you say it's a civic identity in the sense that the nation is defined by all its inhabitants, not just by, which is the largest group, right? Now, we know that, I mean, with the civic, with the Republican liberal, the state is still not neutral, simply because the modern nation state concept, there is still this concept that nations are the basis for the community. So it doesn't mean that they have no, that they're completely neutral, like everybody's okay, but they still, that's the basis of the nation. But it's still, though, that like you want to have this general idea of a civic minded, that the civic identity of the state should take precedence over the ethnic identity. Not that the ethnic group doesn't strive sometimes to take it over there, but in an ideal situation there. And that differentiates it from multicultural democracies, which we'll be talking about more in the second half of the class. I'm not going to go too much into it there. But one of the basic things about that is this is a place where the state is neutral regarding the different ethnic groups within the bounds of the society. And they're looking for, it's trying to be as inclusive as possible there. And I say collective rights there are collective rights, not necessarily legislated. It's not completely true because there are examples. We'll see there's the higher level multicultural democracy, the lower level, the higher level. There are things like reserved seats in parliament and whatnot. But in general, though, you allow for there to be integration if people want to. There are the differences between people. You can choose how much you celebrate those differences, but you certainly try to do as much as possible so that there is no differences, which is very, very different from the ethnic nation states I just mentioned there. And then the last one here is having a consociational democracy, where I think I've already mentioned it before, but just a quick recap is that everyone should have individually their rights should be equal, but you also want to have, in addition to that, special collective rights for minority groups so that they can feel protected and their identity is not threatened. And obviously, in a consociational democracy, this is going to lead to assimilation, which will be nil or next to nil, because in general, everyone has an incentive to remain within their ethnic group. It doesn't mean there isn't intermarriage, and then this is one of the dilemmas you get into, is that when you have intermarriage, which group do you belong to? So that's something that is an inherent problem in consociational democracy. Reality is saying pretty much every system has to adapt and change or die. Eventually, the consociational has certain factors that make it even more, because the consociational democracy, and you can see we're getting to something that's less democratic because it's more rigid in maintaining these differences. And so the will of the people might not necessarily be, the will of the majority might not be heard because the will of the minority is stronger, or at least the interest in protecting their interests. Yeah, Alex?
It's interesting because
Yeah.
like one of my teachers in yeshiva had the whole thing about how, like, in Israeli society we talk about, in Jewish culture we talk about intermarriage, we talk about assimilation, and in Israeli society it's like if a Jewish Israeli marries an Arab, then who's assimilating into whose culture?
Right.
Because people get all crazy about, that's intermarriage, it's not okay. Well, how do you get married?
The interesting thing is, though,
But
is that
like,
in
if you're
Israel,
Arab and you're marrying a Jewish person, then you're marrying into the Jewish culture
yes,
in a way.
yeah. No, in Israel, certainly where it's the majority, because since it has to do with the laws, right? It's quite, because there are, the countries that are ethically oriented countries may have purity laws. But the question is, are you worried about, like in the States, the concern was always like you are impure. Like if you have one drop of black blood, you're black, and then you lose all your privileges of being white. In Israel, it's the opposite. The moment you have any Jewish blood, that's all you need, and you're in. So that so it's more of a positive identity there. We're almost out of time, but I just want to mention Bob Ray's piece, right? Because I have it there as a think piece. There's one major takeaway with there. For those of you who may recall, what is the major takeaway? What did you take away from Bob Ray's essay about exporting democracy, this concept of trying to export democracy? And it's a kind of a simple point, but I think it's a profound point. What is problematic? Like, Western democracies have this like great governmental system. They want to spread democracy. That was succeeding until the early 2000s there. But what's problematic in the whole mission of trying to spread democracy?
Like usually when we think of democracy from a Western standpoint,
Yeah.
and that it's harder to sort of spread the idea of democracy when different countries, some maybe because they're smaller or poor, their ideas aren't seen as valuable as much as the United States. So it's difficult again to spread a singular version of democracy.
Right. Okay, that's one is that the country might not be in the same kind of position, that it doesn't have the luxury, perhaps, of adopting democracy. Yeah. Other ideas? It's problematic. Okay, so I'll just lay it on here, whatever, and then we can always pick up the conversation after. But the main point that Bob Ray makes is that in trying to export, the Westerners don't think about the fact that their democracies had hundreds of years, decades, if not centuries, to develop. They were far from perfect in the early days. You can think about just how the disenfranchisement of women and minorities, blacks, and the way that the indigenous peoples were treated. And then we get, when I say we, the West gets very impatient when a country doesn't have a perfect democracy or there's a backsliding there, and can be very judgmental. And that's problematic because they didn't have the luxury. You're trying to force a system on a different, and also the Western countries chose for democracy by and large. So it was an experiment that they worked on and they have perfected over decades or centuries. And they haven't even perfected them yet. To then try to take these countries that have, different types of relationships and they are different systems, they may not be compatible, right? There are all these different factors that you have to think about that make them different than that. Democracy is not one size fits all. And on top of that, if that's not hard enough to try to graft it onto a country that doesn't have a democratic history, you have the additional burden that the West has the baggage of imperialism, right? The West, part of the reason why the West is so affluent now is precisely because it exploited these other countries and drove them. India, there's research that suggests that India's GDP was greater than Britain's at the time that Britain, conquered India. And then Britain exploited India in order to become up here while India went down here. So, and prosperity is an important factor in the success of democracies. It doesn't mean you can't do it without it, because we'll see Botswana and Estonia, two countries that were very poor, and managed to become solid democracies through various means, without the money, and then they became prosperous. But be that as it may, for most countries, it doesn't necessarily work that way. There might be different cultures and corruption and whatnot. There are all kinds of factors. But so in order to deal with that, if you get involved in the business of trying to help countries become democratic, you have to think strategically. How does that look like? What factors are we taking into? How is it different from traditional democracies? And how do you sell it in a way that doesn't look like you're being patronizing, which are like the very words in here. Those are the basics of it. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for this class. I hope I'll see you at Tel Aviv University sometime in the future after this video comes out. And for the rest of you, we're going to see you after the break. I'm going to pause this. Okay. And on that note, so it's 10 to 5. I want to start again at 5:15, but do you want to start a little bit earlier, or would you rather just assume that we start a little bit earlier? What time? We start at 5 after, 10 after. What? Earlier is good.
Earlier is gonna be.
Okay. Okay, all right, so let's say